Hi, welcome to the second part of our lecture dedicated to taxes, transfers and income distribution. Previously in the first part we covered the topic of taxes, so now we proceed to income distribution. How to research on income distribution in the economy. First of all, we are going to introduce the new unit here. We are not going to investigate income distribution with regard to individuals. That could be highly misleading. You've got here the example of a child, right? A child does not have its own income, but doesn't necessarily mean that the child must be poor. Obviously, it depends on the income of the household. So, household being all related family members and other individuals living in the same housing unit, under the same roof, you could say. This is what is our new unit, a household. Obviously, if you look at your country, you've got millions of citizens. Well, if you are Chinese, then you've got more billion. And if your country is really big, you can have hundreds of millions. So we need to make some simplifications here. We are not going to investigate income distribution with regard to single households, actually. But we are going to introduce the idea of quintiles. We all know what is a half. When you cut something into two equal parts, these are halves. If you divide something into 4 equal parts, these are quarters. Quintiles are the result of dividing something into 5 equal pieces. Therefore, quintile is 20% of the whole. And you can see here quintiles in action. The American society divided into quintiles depending on their income. So, if we put all American households in order by increasing income, then the first 20% of them would have the income of less than 22,826, and that would be the bottom 20% of households in the US, or was in 2001, in fact. The second quintile is made up of families, households, to be more precise, whose income is between 22,826 and 39,600, and so on and so forth. As you can see, the top 20%, the top quintile, has its lower limit of 88,000 without the upper limit. Obviously, this is the part of the society that is the richest one. So if you want to be there, you need to earn at least 88,000, but there is no limit to that. I mean, you will stay in the top 20% no matter how big your income is. We can also have a look at the distribution of family income in the relative way of thinking. Meaning, we can try to have a look what part of the total income in the economy is represented by each quintile of people. Those who are relatively poor, like the bottom 20%, they represent a small fraction of the total income in the economy. There are 20% of them, but their income is relatively low. As you can see, top 20 represents nearly a half of the whole income. So the same number of households that is in the bottom 20% and in the top 20% actually differs in the importance, in the share they represent, like 10 times, even more than 10 times in fact. You can also see in the third column the cumulative percentage of income. So that would show us, for instance, for the second quintile, how much of income is represented by first two quintiles. So this is 4.3 plus 9.9, which equals 14.2. If you look at the cumulative percentage of income for the fourth quintile, you would discover that this is 52.8, which means 4 quintiles have the representation of half of the income, roughly. And the other half is represented by top 20. We are going to need this cumulative approach for measuring income inequality in the society. We do it using the so-called Lorenz curve. Let's see this Lorenz curve here. First of all, axis. The vertical axis represents cumulative percent of income. So that spans from 0 to 100%. The horizontal axis shows us cumulative percent of households. Again, that spans from 0 to 100%. Now, imagine that income is distributed in the society in a perfectly equal way. Each household gets the same income. Then, if you take 1% of households, they would represent 1% of the total income. If you take 5% of households, they would together represent 5% of the total income. If everyone gets the same, then 73% of households would constitute 73% of the total income. So the idea here is, if income was equally distributed across the whole society, we could show it with a straight line, and this line would be called the curve of perfect equality. If income is perfectly equally distributed in the society, the Lorenz curve would look like this, a straight line. Let's consider another theoretical case. Theoretical because obviously perfect equality is just a theoretical concept. You cannot find any real life example of that. So let's use another purely theoretical case. The perfect inequality. How can we illustrate that? Well, look at the case of Poland. Polish economy produces certain income. The most unequal way of distributing this income would be the situation when nobody gets any income apart from one household. So the whole income goes to the one single household, the rest of households gets nothing. That would be the most unequal income distribution. That would be perfectly unequal. Okay, how would it manifest this kind of perfect inequality? If you take 5% of households that don't get any income, they represent 0 share of the income. If you take 10% of households that get no income, they together represent 0% of income. You can also take 40, 50, 70, 80% of households, as long as these are households that get no income, their share in the total income would be 0. So this is this horizontal line here that show us income distribution. This situation continues throughout 70%, 80%, 90%, 95% of households, 99%, 99.9%. You can include all households in the whole economy, apart from this one, the single one that gets the whole income produced, and still you have 0. So actually this line continues up to 100%, and with this last household that gets all the income, we move to the point of 100% cumulative percent of household and 100% cumulative of income. So we move to the top. You can see, therefore, that this curve of perfect inequality has 2 parts, one of them being horizontal for the whole society, apart from this one single household, and the vertical one, when you include this last household. Obviously, in the real life, income distribution is neither perfectly equal nor perfectly unequal. So the real life situations lie somewhere between those 2 curves, the straight line and this bent line. The curve of perfect equality and the curve of perfect inequality. So here you have exemplary Lorenz curve, and you also see the area that represents deviation from perfect equality. The more unequal is income distribution, the bigger is this area. How can we correct for those inequalities? Because one of the significant functions of the government is to redistribute income from those who are very rich to those who are poorer. This is again the curve of perfect equality, and you have here this exemplary Lorenz curve that represents gross income without transfers. Gross income meaning before taxation, without transfers means before any transfer payments are made. Think now of taxation. If taxation is of progressive type, then it would certainly take more money from rich people and less money from poor people. So after taxation, income, net income, is smaller than it was, but rich people lose more and poor people lose less. Therefore, the differences in the net income are smaller than differences in gross income. So that is one step towards greater equality in income distribution. Think of transfers, come to that. Transfers are usually made to support poorer people. By transfers, we actually reduce the gap between the poor and the rich even more. If we decrease this gap, well, the new corrected income distribution would be reflected by this new curve, net income with transfers. You can see the area of deviation is much smaller now. Okay, once more, Lorenz curve. We've got Lorenz curve here, and the question is how convenient it is to show income inequalities with curves. Actually, some measure that is based on numbers, some numerical measure, would be much more appreciated. How we do it? Well, we calculate so-called Gini coefficient. This Gini coefficient heavily relies on Lorenz curve. Have a look. This is A, our area of deviation from perfect equality, and this is B, the rest of this triangle that you could see here. So this triangle is actually divided into A and B areas, and Gini coefficient is about the relation between A and A plus B, the whole triangle that you have here. As you remember, A represents deviation from perfect equality. So the more unequal is income distribution, the bigger is A, and the smaller is B, obviously. Therefore, Gini coefficient measures income inequality. If this inequality in income distribution grows, then A area grows and Gini coefficient gets bigger. What are the values of Gini coefficient? Well, the logics would give us a hint here. If we have perfect equality, then there is no deviation, there is no A area, or A is equal to 0. So 0 divided by A plus B gives you 0 as a result. If there is no inequalities, then Gini coefficient is 0. For perfect inequality, this A area would be as big as it is possible and B would be 0. Hence, if B is 0, then we've got Gini coefficient as A divided by A, which is 1. So we've got Gini coefficient of 0 for perfect equality and 1 for perfect inequality. Sometimes we multiply this Gini coefficient value by 100. That gives us the numbers from 0 to 100. This is basically the same idea here. As you can see, income distribution around the world is subject to high diversity. The more green is the color, the more equal is income distribution. The more reddish or even brown it gets, the more unequal is income distribution. Gray means no data. So we lack data, for instance, for many African countries. You may see that actually all rich countries are quite equal when it comes to income distribution, with the probably one exception of the USA, which is quite orange, still quite rich. Obviously, poor countries like Latin America, South America, or some African countries, they show us high inequality in income distribution. Okay, now it's time for you to try to make your guesses. Please pause this movie for a second and think of those 6 countries that are presented here: Brazil, China, Finland, Poland, Singapore, and United States. They are hidden somewhere in those 14 countries that you can see. So you've got 14 countries, you've got 14 corresponding Gini coefficients. Try to make your guesses. Okay, hopefully you are done. Check whether your answers were correct. To what extent you can feel surprised. You know, Gini coefficient and Lorenz curve may actually be quite useful also when we take a global perspective. Have a look here. This is Gini coefficient and global population. You can see countries in their regions. Sorry, the graph is in Polish, but you can translate it if Polish is a problem. As you can see, half of the population produces like 18% of global gross domestic product. Half of people living in this world are less rich than China on average is. So you can see some examples of countries here as well. Does income distribution change over time? Well, it does, for a number of reasons. First of all, people move from one quintile to another. You can see it very well when you trace someone's career. If you graduate from the university, your first salary would be pretty small. So probably if you start your own household, your income would be relatively low. When you advance your career, your salary tends to grow, and if you are middle-aged, it hits kind of a peak. When you are retired, well, your pension usually is smaller than your salary, so you move down in the income distribution again. As you can see, quite a few people are able to move from one quintile to another. That obviously depends on the economic situation, government policy about that, and many other factors. We shouldn't also forget the composition of households that change over time. When you get married, right? Or when you divorce, when you get additional kids, that all has some impact on your position. What is important here, what we should pay attention to, is the fact that not only distribution of income as such is important, what is important is also distribution of wealth. And this distribution of wealth tends to be far more unequal than income distribution. You may consider the difference between two, let's say, colleagues, right? They graduate from the university, they start their job. One of them gets the salary of 5,000, the other one gets the salary of 10,000. The first one consumes for 4,000. So actually his consumption is 4,000 and he's able to save 1,000 per month. The other one, whose salary is 10,000, has a bigger consumption. Let it be 6,000 per month. So this is 50% bigger consumption. No wonder his income is bigger. But that leaves him with 4,000 saved every month. As you can see, accumulated income over time is 4 times bigger. The first one is able to save 1,000 monthly, the other guy is able to save 4,000. That shows you why distribution of wealth might actually be more unequal. What is more If you are already a wealthy person, then your possibilities of increasing your wealth are generally bigger than the possibilities of someone who's poorer. That would even magnify those differences. Have a look at wealth distribution. Obviously, these are some estimates here, but as you can see, the wealth is 10% of global population owned almost 90% of the global wealth. That's a lot. 10% of people owning 90% of wealth. That's a lot. Can we inherit our financial status? Can we inherit poverty, or can we inherit wealth? Yes, of course. The question whether you're going to have a low or high salary in the future depends on you, obviously, but also it depends on the financial status of your parents. To what extent? Well, here the concept of elasticity proves to be very useful again. If we say the income of your parents have some influence on your future income, and that's quite obvious, that's easy to accept, then we may start wondering how strong this influence is. And elasticity is good at measuring how strong something influences something else. So we can develop the idea of intergenerational elasticity of income. That's very difficult to pronounce. Intergenerational elasticity of income, which simply tells you how much 1% increase in your parents' income would affect your expected income. To what extent, how strongly your expected income depends on the income of your parents. If this elasticity is high, that means that your income depends very much on income of your parents. So the social mobility is pretty low. If you are rich, you are very likely to remain rich, but if you are poor, then you are very likely to remain poor. This is low. This is what low social mobility is about. What does this intergenerational elasticity of income depend on? It turns out that it may depend on Gini coefficient. It may depend on how equal or unequal is income distribution in the society. Have a look. This is the so-called Great Gatsby curve. Great Gatsby. You may be familiar with the book by Scott Fitzgerald, or with a movie with Leonardo DiCaprio starring there as Great Gatsby. Look at the graph. There are some countries where intergenerational earnings elasticity is pretty low. These are Finland, Norway, Denmark. Those countries, Scandinavian countries in fact, are also characterized by low inequality, low Gini coefficient. When you look at the United States of America, you see that this Gini coefficient is much higher, and intergenerational earnings elasticity is also high. If you were born in a poor family in the United States, your chances are very high to be poor in the future. On the positive side, if you were born in a very rich family, you are quite likely to be rich in the future as well. Much greater mobility, social mobility, can be perceived, can be seen in Scandinavian countries, which seems to be more fair, more just. In those countries, the question whether you are rich and successful or poor and unsuccessful depend much more on your own actions rather than on the question whether your parents are rich or not. The problem of poverty is obviously a big one. We are not going to discuss it very extensively. You can obviously look up some books, some articles on that. I want you just to remember that the problem of poverty is the problem that is present in each and every country. It's a problem that is a little bit subjective. Subjective because we measure poverty by the so-called poverty line and see, look here at this definition, an estimate of the minimum amount of annual income required for a family to avoid severe economic hardship. So you can see the clue here is avoiding severe economic hardship, and the question is, what does that really mean? And obviously that means different things in different countries, in different societies. In some African countries, that would mean obviously something different than in Norway, let's say. So you've got some examples of poverty line for the United States of America, 1999. And you can see that this poverty line depends on the size of the family. So it grows with the size of family, but it doesn't grow proportionally. For individuals, this poverty line is like 8,500. For 4 persons, this is 17,000. So it's like twice as much for 4 persons instead of 1 individual, right? If we look at Poland, then for 2015, we had this poverty line for individuals at 540, not that much as you can see. For 4 persons, that would be less than 1,500. And in 2015, we had like 7% of population that was below that level. As you can see, poverty in Poland is still some issue. Perhaps it's not a very popular issue, but it is a significant one. There are also some interesting pieces of data from income expectations of Poles that was published for 2015. So on average, we believed that slightly below 1,200 per person is enough to satisfy basic needs. As you can see, this is pretty different from this poverty line that you can see at 540. Nearly 2,000 per person per month is sufficient for medium-level life, according to respondents. According to them, 2,600 per person means wealthy life. You can compare it with disposable income for 2014, which would say that, well, on average, people in Poland get the income that is above the level necessary to satisfy basic needs, but still, if you want to live medium level life, this disposable income would not be enough. I wonder if you can find similar data for your country. If you can, then you may share it with some comments, for instance. That would be very much appreciated. Okay, thank you very much. That's all for today. We finished our lecture. A like would be appreciated. You may subscribe to our channel. Stay tuned. Bye.